Hi, this is Tom Kessler. I'm a professor at University of Baltimore and also Central Michigan University. Your instructor, professor, has asked me to do a presentation on derivation of governmental powers. And so I'm going to try to go through this fairly expeditiously and just provide sort of a framework and background regarding where government has derived its powers. So let's begin. Okay, got to get my slides to move forward here. So, government size and complexity. Many of you who are listening likely work in public or not-for-profit sectors. So if you don't, you aspire to do so. And there's lots of reasons, you don't get laid off, or at least that's the perception in the public sector. There's good wages and benefits, and it's certainly been my experience that the salaries and compensation is pretty good. You might be interested in serving the public or the needy, or it might just be serendipity. Somebody or relatives said, look, there's a job opening at the U.S. Postal Service, and you got that job, or you're trying to get that job. When we think about administrative government entities, we know that when we think about government, there's just large, vast, and complex collections of organizations and departments and agencies just everywhere you turn: state, local, city government, state government, and just tons and tons of federal agencies that do stuff. So the complexity of government is fairly massive. It's probably easier to think about the private sector than the public sector. When we think about the federal government, there's hundreds, really literally hundreds of departments and bureaus and specialized entities. Excuse me. Many with headquarters and far-flung regional offices. And when we think about the U.S. State Department, for example, there's embassies all over the world, right? It's a very large institution. You think about the U.S. Department of Agriculture, has lots of branches and offices throughout sort of the farming area and other agricultural hotspots in the U.S., including the far west. We think about our state government. We know we have state offices throughout the state, like departments of motor vehicles and places where people can go and get their driver's licenses renewed. And even with local government, while things generally tend to be centralized, we can see lots and lots of bureaus and departments and other entities. So I guess what we can say is government is large and complex. Here's numbers just to prove that. There's according to this slide, 89,000, almost 90,000 government entities in the United States, including national, state, county, municipal, townships, school districts, and special districts, and just lots of things. So the question is, how do we get here? Was government always this large and complex? And what about the idea of thinking about government before we actually were a nation? I mean, how did things sort of look before we had the revolution? Trying to adjust the volume just a little bit. How did things look before we had the United States and before it existed, before the Declaration of Independence in 1776? Well, our government prior to 1776, really actually prior to 1792, was really the British government. It was really, we were run by Great Britain. Our colonies were really just branches of the British Commonwealth, and each colony was governed by a representative from either the king or the parliament or whatever lord was assigned privileges to own the real estate in the colonies here in the New World. After independence, and the Revolutionary War went on for 8 years. So it really wasn't until the 1780s where the British decided they've had enough and they backed out. And so the U.S. put together this thing called the Articles of Confederation, which really formed the replacement government for what Great Britain had in place. And you can appreciate that given 8 years of war and the bitterness between the loyalists who stayed loyal to the king and the revolutionary types who wanted independence from the king, there was just a lot of bitterness in the colonies. There was really a resentment towards a large centralized power like a king. for example. And so the states retained their freedom and their independence under the Articles they put in place the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, the states really had lots of freedom and independence. They had a vote in a very weak national Congress, really central government, but central government had no power, couldn't tax, couldn't raise an army, and it was a real problem. For the time that the Articles of Confederation were in place, from about 1786 to 1792, for 5 or 6 year period, Congress didn't have money since it couldn't raise taxes to pay for an army or a navy, and therefore the nation was kind of vulnerable to France or England or Spain or anybody who wanted to invade, and also couldn't repay Revolutionary War debts. Money it had borrowed to fight the war. It couldn't repay the soldiers and had to give them land instead of money and stuff. So it was a real mess. So the result was that really each state functioned like an independent country. So the original 13 colonies really were had become like 13 countries, and each had their own currency and their trade agreements with other states and other nations. The states didn't function as a nation, and they were vulnerable to foreign attack, and there was really a weak economy because if I lived in Pennsylvania and I have my money, my Pennsylvania currency, and you came over from Maryland with your Maryland currency, we just wouldn't honor it. And so the idea of economic vibrancy wasn't there because each state had its own currency and its own financial system and its own barter and trade system. And so it was kind of a mess. So if we push ourselves forward, we recognize that because of these problems, and again, recognize at the time there's very little government in the U.S. and minimal taxation, that we started this process called federalism by establishing the U.S. Constitution. And we're going to take some time today, briefly, to talk about the Constitution in general and what powers it granted to the federal and the state governments. So by 1787, there was a recognition by the colonies that things weren't going well, and so there was a need for a new constitution. So the Constitutional Convention was called in Pennsylvania, and every colony or state sent representatives. And so the charter of this group was to build a constitution. And sort of the lead guy on the Articles of the Declaration of Independence was Thomas Jefferson, but the lead person for the Constitution was James Madison, aided by a number of very talented founding folks as well. So the U.S. Constitution established a system of federalism, and federalism was really where the national government shared the powers with the state governments and the local governments. The U.S. Constitution divided the power between the federal and state governments, and that's what we're going to go over in the next pile of slides, right? So recognize that federalism is really, it's a term that says that under federalism, we don't have a unitary system where all power resides within the national government, and we don't have all the power residing in the local as well. That's what we had under the Articles of Confederation. What we really have is the states and the federal government being sovereign, independent of each other, but sharing in sort of the power and getting things done. So why federalism? The original states already existed at the time of the Revolution. The states created the federal government, not the other way around. The states came together and actually established the Constitution, ratified the Constitution. And today some people say, things in the Constitution aren't right. Some people don't like the Second Amendment, which they want more restrictions on firearms. But you can't change the Constitution easily. You need 2/3 of all states to ratify changes. And you know how bitterly divided things are today politically, and from the perspective of the farming states versus the urban states, and it's just a problem. And so to get the Constitution changed is a very, very, very difficult thing to do, and it's very rare for the Constitution to be amended and changed. So the states created the federal government, not the other way around. Former colonists distrusted strong central governments, and that's why we had initially the Articles of Confederation, but eventually through the great efforts of James Madison and some of his associates like Alexander Hamilton, and the publication of the Federalist Papers, which were a series of short papers published in the newspapers that sort of argued the pros and cons and sort of pushed the citizens to push their states to ratify the U.S. Constitution. So federalism allowed the 14 former colonies to unite in a useful and efficient way, create a military body, have a common currency, a coherent trade policy, but it also kept a lot of the functions local, and we'll talk about that. So the real question here is what benefits were gained that would have been impossible had we had 13 small countries, and we'll sort of see that as we go through this. Constitution's allocation of power. So how did the Constitution do this? Well, it granted two types of power to the federal government, express power and implied or implicit power. The express powers, and there's 17 of them, are found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and the implied powers are found at the end of Section 8, which grants Congress the right to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the express powers. So these 17 express powers are quite important. Recognize also that the Constitution has something called a Supremacy Clause, and in Article 6 of the Constitution says that the laws of Congress shall be the supreme law of the land. Now, we're going to get into this semester quite a bit. You're going to have to, in one of your discussions, sort of debate issues, and in a particular paper, take a position on an issue and really sort of debate sort of the nuances of this Supremacy Clause. Anyway, the Supremacy Clause means that when a federal and state law collide, the federal one will prevail or be dominant. And that's important. We're going to get into that. Think about sanctuary cities today and illegal immigration. And boy, there's just a lot of collision because cities don't want the federal government to enforce the laws to deport people who've come to the U.S. illegally. And so there's just a lot of problems with this today, and we'll talk about this in subsequent weeks. States have significant powers as well as the federal government. The 10th Amendment says powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. For example, police powers. A state has the ability to regulate the health, the safety, and the morale and welfare of its citizens. States also define and regulate private property, so it's up to the states to decide how property is sold and bought and what the contracts look like, etc. There's something called concurrent powers, where the states and federal government share certain powers. There's also something called the Comity Clause, which is kind of important because it guarantees that if I move from Maryland to Pennsylvania or Maryland to Florida, that I'm a citizen of the United States, and therefore if I go to another state, I enjoy all the privileges and immunities that everyone else in that state has. And this is really important because it lets us move freely throughout the country and live in different states, but still be not be treated sort of differently because we came from some other state, at least legally. There are limits on power among the states. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter an agreement with another state. So you can't get like 5 or 6 states pulling together to do things or pass laws together. No creation of sort of power blocks within the United States without the approval of Congress. So it's kind of important as well because it kind of keeps things squared away. So a quick review of the history. We'll just dash through these slides. You have to write a paper in week 2 that talks really about the history and the evolution of public administration. And this is an important part of it. So when we talk about the changing federal framework, if we look at the period from the founding, passage of the Constitution, 1789 through 1937. Now that's a long time, right? It's 125 years. If we look at that 125-year period, we are in a period of what's called dual federalism, and we'll get into that in a second. Then from 1937, which is really the end of the Great Depression or the efforts to end the Great Depression, the Roosevelt years, the New Deal, we have something called Cooperative Federalism. And then if we look at the period where I grew up, the 60s and 70s, we have something called regulated federalism. And then from the late 70s up to now, something called new federalism. And we'll get into that again throughout the semester. We'll come up against those issues as well. So the early period, the colonial period, after we first set up the country, is referred to as a period of dual federalism, 89 and 1937. Constitutional interpretation gave the federal government exclusive control over some issues and the states exclusive control over others. It was quite clear, right? It wasn't gray. It was sort of black and white. The federal government was small and dealt primarily with foreign affairs and commerce. There wasn't lots of agencies and lots of jobs and lots of stuff, right? It was small federal government. In addition to internal improvements like roads and canals, tariffs, patents, and currency were the purview of the federal government. This is kind of small and it's difficult to read, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but you can sort of see the state was in charge of a lot of things. That's the middle column. And the federal government, national government, was in charge of a few things, and local governments had some things as well, mostly like, trash and schools and some basic local things. So that's what dual federalism looked like. States performed the majority of governing over the day-to-day lives of people, and experimented with different policies, whereas the federal government had sort of like a fairly constrained role. It really took more than 150 years for the federal government to get to a point where it got so big and so complex that it then came and started to actually impact the lives of citizens on a regular daily basis. And this was really a shift brought about. The end of dual federalism really came about through a series of Supreme Court decisions, McCulloch versus Maryland and Gibbons versus Ogden. Since the New Deal, and the New Deal really was a time when we had a Great Depression in 1929. There was 25% of the workforce was unemployed and people were starving and there was no jobs. And so the federal government took a very activist role. It said, we've got to get the economy moving again. And so it used a unique clause in the Constitution, the Commerce Clause, which said that the government can regulate things that have interstate commerce implications. And this, since 1937, really this perspective has been, there's a lot of debate and argument about the fact that the federal government can claim almost anything, it can do almost anything because of this interstate commerce clause. So the federal government has really just gotten large and aggressive in many areas, and it's used the Commerce Clause to justify what it does, even though the Constitution does not give it explicit power to do things. It uses its implicit power to regulate and to be involved in state matters through the justification under the Commerce Clause. If states don't like it, if citizens don't like it, they can go to the Supreme Court with a case, and the Supreme Court ultimately decides whether the issue that's being debated is legitimate under the Commerce Clause or not. And so it can cause the federal government to stop doing things or to approve it to continue to do things. Congress can also influence the states to enact laws by promising federal funds, and this is a big part of federalism today, where, on education, we didn't have a Department of Education for most of our existence. Then all of a sudden we created a Department of Education. It was small at first and didn't do much, and then we started channeling money to states. So now states are using federal money to pay teachers and do other things, and therefore the federal government can say, do things this way or else we'll reduce your funding. And so now it has not explicit control over schools and education in states, but it has a lot of control through this funding process. And education is one example. So if we think about the period in the mid-1900s, from 1937 to 1960, that period is called Cooperative Federalism, and that's the period after the New Deal. And the New Deal came out of the Great Depression. It was Roosevelt's Great Society. We created Social Security. We created Medicaid, Medicare, and a lot of other things that were really social safety nets or social programs as a result of all the suffering that came out of the Great Depression. So the New Deal is a big deal. The federal government does a lot of things, giving grants to states, and therefore it can influence what happens in the states. And so that's sort of a big deal. Cooperative federalism is the model in which various levels of government work together to solve policy problems, often with the federal government providing some portion of the funding. Now, this is we're not going to talk about the Affordable Care Act today, but a big part of the Affordable Care Act and getting it passed was the fact that the federal government agreed to pay this large expansion of Medicare so that poor people, really now middle-class people, can get on Medicare. And through the year 2020, the federal government said it would pay almost all of the costs of this large expansion. The real question we should all have in our minds is what happens after 2020 when the federal government's contributions to Medicaid to the states drops down significantly, and the states really then can no longer afford to pay Medicare. And so that's ahead of us in a couple of years. We'll sort of see what happens there. But this is the idea of cooperative federalism, where the federal government gives money to the states and encourages them to do things, and it has some power and influence over the states as well. So this is just an example since 1950, in billions of dollars, from almost zero in 1950 to $550 billion, how much the federal government sends to states. There was an expansion of national power. Expansion of national power diminishes the old paradigm of dual federalism, right? It's no longer like the states do this and the federal government does that. It's like the federal government is now sort of in charge because we're sending you money, and if you don't do what we want, we're going to withhold our money, etc. So cooperation between state and national governments replaces dual federalism, so it's now called cooperation. And there's a cake analogy, and we'll get into this later, layer cake and marble cake in terms of how we get involved in different issues. It sort of looks like this. Layer cake under the dual federalism prior to 1937 was national government did certain things and state government did certain things. And now it's a lot murkier now, right? So the national government and state governments do things. Like think about highways and roads, right? There's national highways and there's state highways. And there's local roads, and who pays to fix them. A lot of discussion over the last 6 or 7 years about massive increases in taxes so we can have massive infrastructure project so that we can fix the nation's crumbling infrastructure. Well, is it the federal government's responsibility and say the taxpayers in North Dakota's responsibility to fix state and local roads in Florida? I mean, who pays? And so a lot of the debate goes back and forth about this new concept of cooperative federalism. And then when we think about cooperative federalism, we turn our attention to really our contemporary times, and we have really what's called regulated federalism and new federalism. A couple of slides here. Regulated federalism says, if I give you money, states, I'm going to come in and tell you exactly how to use it and check to make sure you're doing it that way. So now it's no longer like the states are independent of the federal government. It's like the states are like branches of the federal government. And so that's sort of how it works today. And this concept of preemption, this is a principle that allows the national government to override state and local actions in some areas. And so when the state and local actions don't agree with the national requirements, this is a big deal. We're kind of seeing this with illegal immigration today. We're seeing sanctuary cities trying to say illegal aliens can come and live here and they won't be deported. And the federal government saying, but the law says they're illegal, they came to the country illegally, and they should be deported. So, who's right and who's wrong? And so you have this idea of preemption and lots of conflict and stress in our political environment today. Regulated federalism, Congress dramatically increased unfunded mandates. It's another big issue you hear about all the time, unfunded mandates, where the Congress tells states they have to do such and such, but doesn't give them any money. You have to spend your own money to comply with what we want you to do. And, of course, that gets taxpayers upset. And there's this backlash to this federal preemption unfunded mandates. And this backlash has been a big deal over the past few years. And then there's new federalism. Nixon and Reagan efforts to devolve many policies back to the states. It's sort of like a Republican point of view. Reagan cut federal aid to states by 12% to remove federal government from the lives of the citizens of the states. And this is a comparison slide. I'm not going to spend any time on it because I'm 22 minutes into the discussion, and I want to give you time to digest and process and reflect. But you can sort of see the difference between regulated federalism was state governments were asked to provide the ingredients, and the national government was giving the recipe. So the national government said we need to do this, and it was up to the state governments as to how to do it. But with new federalism now, the national government gives money, and then the state governments spend the money to get things done. So that's this idea of kind of shifting around with this kind of fueling federal monies into states and state governments and state programs. So since 2000, balance between federal government and states has been evolving. There's been a lot of issues, national and state issues and concerns since 2000. This idea of the Real ID Act, can states require voters, or should they require voters to show a picture ID card, or is that discriminatory, right? No Child Left Behind has been a big issue in education. The Stimulus Act, right, of shovel-ready projects and rebuilding the infrastructure. Affordable Care Act, Obamacare has been a big issue and continues to be a massively big issue. Medical and recreational marijuana usage, some states allow it now and the federal government does not. So it says the federal government arrests people if it finds them using marijuana in a state that's approved marijuana laws. Sanctuary cities and federal immigration enforcement. So lots of issues, and we'll come back to this when you will, when you have your week where you get involved in intergovernmental relations. So I want to just conclude by saying that the purpose of our discussion today was to discuss how agencies get born. The idea that government organizations are typically created by legislatures, and that's usually done based on a perceived public need or benefit. Presidents, governors can also seek creation or consolidation of administrative entities, but really it's up to a legislature to authorize and fund creation of agencies and ongoing operations of agencies. Sometimes agencies are created for obvious needs. Was there a Department of Motor Vehicles in the 1800s? No, but once we had motor vehicles, did they need to be controlled and regulated? Well, not initially, but then eventually, right? And then there are agencies and changes that are caused through cause and effect. And you think about September 11th, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center. We had a bunch of disparate agencies that were pulled together under the Department of Homeland Security, and a new one created, the Transportation Safety Administration. Many of you probably don't remember when you could just walk into an airport and walk down to your jetway. That's how it used to be, but now you have to go through security. It's called security quotes. Right? Interstate Commerce Commission was established in 1887. Right? Why was it created? Because farmers and merchants were kicking up a storm because the railroads had raised these outrageous fees to ship their products to market. So we created the Interstate Commerce Commission. We're going to see something like a federal drug commerce commission where we control the prices of drugs. After we see press accounts where some young person took control of a pharmaceutical and jacked the price up 8,000 times on a drug that people need to stay alive, and perhaps, but this is how federalism and government and public sector and public policy all works. So in conclusion, we've talked about the U.S. federal and state governments and how they were created after the Revolutionary War. There wasn't a lot of government for really over 100 years, and it was non-intrusive and taxes were low. And as this new state was admitted to the Union, it had set up its government. Initially, governments provided basic services, very basic: national defense, public safety. Taxes were low. Agencies were generally managed by elected officials or appointees. But over time, as we've seen in our discussion today, and we'll talk about more over the semester, you will, with your professor, Professor Kelly, over time, and for many reasons, the government administrative apparatus has grown to its current large and complex size. So it's incumbent on us as a student of public administration to really understand and appreciate sort of the big picture, what these interoperable parts are all about. And then also how administrators administer programs, policies, and organizations, because that's really what you're getting your degree in. And when you finish your MPA and start pursuing your doctorate in public administration, you'll continue your studies and get more deeply into the issues. So I hope this has been useful to you, and good luck in your class. And perhaps I'll visit again with another lecture later in the semester.